In this tutorial, we're going to use RayTK to build a scene with a complex torus shape and sweeping planes of color moving through it. You don't need any prior RayTK experience, but it might still be helpful to check out the first few videos in the intro series, or you could do that afterwards. Either way works. I'm going to be using RayTK version 0.45, so just make sure you're using at least that version. I'm also going to be using the TouchDesigner production build, not the latest experimental one with pops, because there's an issue with the RayTK palette. Other than that, the toolkit works okay in the experimental, but the palette thing can be kind of annoying, so I'm just doing it in the production TouchDesigner. Check the video description for download link for RayTK. I'm also going to be including a download for an enhanced version of the scene for Patreon subscribers, so there's going to be a link in the description for that as well if you want to check it out. The first step is to load the toolkit talks into your project. I like to do that at the root outside of the main project comp because you don't get as many of these confusing connection lines in there, but if you don't mind those, stick it wherever you feel like. Open the RayTK palette using the Alt-R shortcut, and then we're going to type in RayMarch Render 3D, and then drop one of those into your network. Then drag out from the first output and create a null top, and then you can either toggle on the display flag there to show it in the background, or right-click it and do view to open in another window or something. I'm going to be using this panel off to the side just so that everything kind of fits in the frame for the recording. But if you're interested in how I have this set up, there is a download for that on my Patreon as well, a template file that I use for tutorials. Let's go back over to select the renderer. And then we're going to open RayTK's Editor Tools menu with Alt-Shift-R. And under Add Camera, choose Look at Camera. And then we're going to do something similar. Go back to the renderer, select that, Alt-Shift-R. And then under Add Light, choose Point Light. On the camera, let's set the position to around like 3, 2, and 4 so that we get a little bit of an angle there. And then on the light, we're going to set that to around like 2, 1, and 2. You can fine tune that later on once we have actual, shapes to see the light. Then, you can make decisions about where the light goes, but for now, this is good enough. So this scene is going to be based on a torus shape. So we're going to start by creating a Torus SDF. And then connect that up to the first input on the renderer. So on this Torus SDF, change the axis to Z so that it's kind of facing the front, even though we're kind of viewing it from an angle, but generally speaking, facing the front. And then we can bring up the radius to around like 0.8 and thickness to maybe 0.5. So the idea here is to get it to kind of mostly fill the vertical height of the render without totally filling it and, leaving a little bit of an edge around it. So that's it for the torus itself, which, is kind of boring. So let's add some additional detail to that. Open the palette again with Alt-R. And then this time we're going to create a Torus Grid SDF. And change the axis to Z. And then let's combine these two by selecting both the Torus SDF and the Torus Grid. And then doing Alt-Shift-R. And under Combine SDF, choose Simple Union. And then you can connect that combine up to the renderer. So we can't really see much of what's going on there because the Torus grid doesn't match the right size. So let's fix that. On the Torus SDF, right-click the radius parameter and then choose Copy. And then go over to the Torus grid, right-click its radius parameter, and then choose Paste Reference. And then we're going to do the same thing for the thickness parameter. So copy that on the Torus and then paste as a reference on the Torus grid. So now they're going to match their size. And we can adjust both of them, and they're always going to line up. On the Torus Grid SDF, let's drop the bar thickness down to maybe like 0.02, just so that you get a little bit of an edge there. And then let's increase the columns to 12 You can adjust that to something else if you like. I like 12 just because it gives enough detail while still kind of leaving some areas in there that we can get some more interesting stuff going on in. You can also use the 2 parts of the shift parameter to shift that grid around the torus, either, around that central axis or around the kind of cross section of the torus itself. We're going to animate this later on to get some movement. So next we'll use SDF blending to add some detail to what we have already. Right now, there are actually kind of 3 SDFs. I mean, technically there's a lot more than that, but it's kind of helpful to think about it in terms of 3. So we have our Torus SDF, which is kind of the filled in solid surface there. And then for the grid is actually 2 different parts. So there are what are called rows and columns. And you can use this parts parameter to have it show only the rows, which are kind of like rings around that center axis like that, or columns, which are kind of perpendicular to that, like cross sections of the torus. But we'll switch it back to both. But the idea is that we are using SDF combining for combining the 2 different parts of the grid, as well as for combining the grid with the main torus. When we have both of the parts switched on the Torus grid, we have an option down here for combine modes. Right now it's set to simple union, which is just kind of giving us like the area of both of the shapes without doing anything special. So we can switch that over to smooth union, and then we can bring up this radius, and that's going to blend out those areas of transition between the 2 parts of the grid. Then over on the combine, we have pretty much the same types of parameters here, where we could change this to smooth union if you want, and then you have basically the same parameters. But instead, for this one, let's go with stair union. Now, it can be a little bit hard to see what's going on there, so you can kind of zoom in on your render by just middle dragging with the mouse. In a top view, or at least for other kinds of things, it might be different interaction, but so we have this radius parameter that controls how big that area of blending is. And across that area, it's going to show a bunch of steps with right angles on them. We can control the number of steps with this number parameter. So if you turn it really high, you'll see kind of like almost a gradient going between them. But let's keep it down to, maybe 3, 4, something around there. And then you can use this radius to control how big that blending area is. And so we want to bring that up enough that we get some detail without it like totally filling in those areas in between the parts of the grid. So I'm going to set that to around like 0.15, something around there. Then we can use this offset parameter to shift those stairs across the blend area. So we're going to animate this later on to get some really nice continuous motion out of that. So that on its own can look pretty cool. If we want, you can also go over to the grid and try doing a stair mode here as well. So instead of just doing like smooth union and getting like those kind of rounded areas, you could go with stair union, and then you get all this extra little detail in there, these kind of cross shapes. And, we can increase the number of steps in there, although I think 3 probably works pretty well. And bring up that blend radius. And you can even drive this all the way up so that it kind of like totally fills in, but I think that kind of loses some of the interesting elements that I like. So I'm going to keep it around like 0.15. And then again, with this one, we have an offset that we can use to create some really cool continuous motion that we'll deal with later on. So aside from animating those 2 offsets on the blends, we're basically done with the kind of the shape part of this, so we can move on to the color. The goal here is to define planes that kind of sweep across the shape, applying color just like within a narrow band that moves across that whole shape. So to do that, let's create an assign color, or 8C, you can use that shortcut, and insert that after the combine and then before the renderer. So by default, that is just filling everything with this kind of white color. So it's assigning, that color attribute to the surface, and then the default material that's built into the renderer is using that. And we're getting a little bit of blue shading in there just because of how that default material works. We're going to end up swapping that out later. So rather than just using the same color for every part of the surface, we want to use a field to provide different color in different spots. So we can do that with a band field. So let's create one of those. And then you can wire that up to the second input on the assign color. So now that gives us a area where on the inside we're applying this one color, and then on the outside we're applying a different one. To make it a little bit easier to see what's going on for this outside value, let's click that and just bring it up a little bit to 0.1, something like that, just so that you can actually see some of the shape while still being able to show, where the highlighted part is. On the band field, we have a few different settings that control where that band goes. So we have the center, which will move it across whatever axis we have selected. And so that's getting us these kind of cross sections that sweep across the whole area of the shape. Then we have width, which controls, how thick that band is. And then we have blending that smooths out the transition between, the inside and the outside of that band. Then we can choose different axes. So right now we're just looking at the x-axis, but I think the z-axis looks particularly interesting, especially as you sweep it up and get to the part where you're kind of like tracing out those individual shapes that show up where the crosses are. That stuff's going to look really good. So let's keep it on the z-axis. There's also a setting where you can switch on repeat, which be a little bit easier to see over in the X one, where you're kind of like repeating that line every so often. But note that when you're using repeat, you want to make sure that the center is, somewhere between 0 and 1, so that it falls in the area that's being repeated, so it isn't just getting cut off. But for this one, let's keep the repeat setting off, and then we can just use that center to kind of position it along the z-axis. So don't worry about picking particular positions. We're going to animate this later on and then add some rotation stuff anyway, so it's not really worth spending time on that yet. So rather than just keeping things on that z-axis like perfectly aligned, let's add a rotate and insert that between the band field and the assign color. So it'll take a second while it recompiles. And then when it's ready on the rotate, we've got these 3 parameters here where we can rotate that cut plane. So you can try out different angles there that look good. And I'm going to go with something that's kind of like, I don't know, maybe -20, -15, 0, or something like that. The Z rotation isn't going to do anything because, it's already around the Z axis. It's just kind of like rotating a circle in a circle. Doesn't really do anything. So this gives us kind of one band that we can sweep across, but more would be even better. So let's combine 2 more of them. So let's take band field and the rotate, copy those, and then paste 2 copies of them. There are a few different ways that we could combine these 3 different fields. And we can get to several of those by selecting all 3 of the rotates, doing Alt-Shift-R. And then there are a few options. There's combine fields or composite fields. In this case, I'm going to use mix fields and pick the additive mode. So this operator was added, I believe, in 0.44. It is a nice way to combine a few different fields, and it gives you toggles and level sliders for each one, kind of all centralized in one place. There is actually also in 0.45 an operator called mix color fields, which unfortunately in this version, there's a bug which causes an error. But if you're watching this in the future, if you're in version 0.46 or later, then you can use this one instead. And that'll give you separate color settings that you can kind of like control all the colors in one centralized place. But if you're using 45 or earlier, then we can just stick with mix fields. So connect that up to the assigned color, and it's kind of just going to look like a more blown out version of the same thing. And that's because they're all still sitting on top of each other, adding up all their colors. So the first thing to do there on all 3 of these is to just drop the outside value down to 0. Or you can leave it on for one of them just so that you don't get like all of their outside areas adding up all together. Or you could set it to black if you kind of like it to be, completely hidden in some areas. Anyway, let's just adjust the rotation to kind of position them a little bit differently so that you can kind of see where they are and keep them separate from each other. Doesn't really matter what values you pick here, just get them so that they're not on top of each other. And then we can go into settings on the band field and adjust the colors. So for the first one, you can pick a color there. Don't spend too much time picking colors here because like the material is going to influence that later on. Just kind of give it a way to make them distinct enough that you can kind of tell which is which. So you can even just pick, primary colors or something if you want. Then you can try adjusting the rotation to get those into a pattern that looks interesting to you. You could also try swapping out different axes, although you can kind of get the same effect by just controlling the rotation. And you can adjust the blending settings. So you want to have, one that's a smoother transition, but like a narrower area or something. You can do that. And just kind of give yourself like an interesting combination that looks good to you. So for the first one, I'm going to go with like maybe 10, 11 zeros that get it kind of mostly aligned to the z-axis, but not quite. Then for the second one, I'm going to do maybe like negative 16 and like 28, something like that. And then for the third one, gonna do like 15, negative 20 something, 24, something around there. And before spending time on the colors and the details there, let's just set up a material first. So let's do that. Let's create a modular map and insert that between the assigned color and the renderer. So things are going to go dark because we haven't yet added any shading. So with the modular map selected, do Alt-Shift-R to open the editor tools. Under Add Diffuse, choose Aura Nair. Now, it's going to be kind of my standard combination of Aura Nair and GGX shading because it kind of seems like that's all I ever really want to use, but it tends to be a good combination, so let's go with that. Then select the modular mat again, Alt-Shift-R, this time under Add Specular, choose GGX. So it'll take a second while it recompiles. And then before we tune those, let's do a little quick optimization trick. So we're going to select both the diffuse and the specular, and then open the editor tools with Alt-Shift-R. And then this time under Lock Parameter, choose Method. And that's going to bake in those shading method choices into the shader, and it's going to make things run a bit faster. If you're curious about what that is and why that works, I made a video about that in the RayTK optimization series that gets into a bunch more detail about it. And if you decide that you want to try different types of shading, you can either use the editor tools and unlock, or you can right-click on the parameter and choose toggle read only. Note, though, that that technique only works for certain parameters, so check out that video if you want details. So with that baked in, we can start to refine our settings. On the diffuse, I'm going to bring up the roughness a bit to maybe 0.7, something around there, and bring up albedo maybe like 0.9 or so. And then on the specular, to spread out that highlighting, bring up the roughness to maybe 0.6. I kind of like to have a little bit of a shiny look on this one, but not super metallic looking. And then bring up Fresnel there to brighten things a bit, maybe 0.9. So now that that's set up, we can get into refining the choices of colors that we made for the bands. So head over to your band fields, and you can choose whatever color combination looks good to you. For this first one, I'm going to go with kind of a pale green, a little more desaturated than that, something around there. For the second one, I'm going to go with kind of a lavender, like desaturated purple, maybe a little bit more bluish. Maybe like that. And then for the last one, I'm going to go with more of like a kind of pale blue, maybe even a more saturated blue, like that. And then you can, refine the settings on the blending and the width of the slices if you want, or you can save that part for later on. You can also use on the mix field the enable toggles to switch on the bands or to vary their brightness if you want to do it all in one kind of central location. The last step is to add some animation to this. And we're going to do that in a few different places by animating parameters, just using some of the built-in tools that RayTK comes with. First place is going to be over on our SDF. So we mentioned earlier that on both of these, the Combine and the Torus Grid, we have this blend offset, which moves the stair patterns. So let's animate those, and we can start with the Torus Grid SDF. So select that, open the editor tools with Alt-Shift-R, and then under Animate with Speed, choose Blend Offset. And then for the Combine, we're going to do a similar thing. Select that, Alt-Shift-R, and under Animated Speed, choose Offset. Then you can try different combinations of speeds there, or maybe like reverse one of them. You can get some really cool looks by varying those to different settings, but you can refine that later. Then the other setting that we're going to animate here is on the Torus Grid. We mentioned earlier that we have that shift that will move that entire pattern around the torus. So let's select the Torus Grid, and then Alt-Shift-R under Animate with Speed. And then this time you could either choose the full shift parameter, in which case you would have rotation around the axis as well if you want. But I'm actually just going to do the second part since I don't really like when it's spinning around the axis in this case. So I'm just going to go with the other one. And then for this one, I'm going to switch on the reverse setting so that it's coming kind of out of the center rather than going in, but that's just a matter of personal preference. Then we're going to do something similar for the color bands. So we have two approaches. One of those is going to be to switch on that repeat setting and make sure that your center is, around 0.5 or somewhere in the middle there. And then you can use the shift to move it all the way across, and it'll just kind of like continuously repeat, always going in the same direction. So we can do that for the first one here. So we switch on repeat, and you can adjust the size if you want to, pack the stripes in closer together. Just note that you might have to adjust the center to get it to kind of like sit in the right spot so it's not getting cut off. But I'm actually just going to leave it at 1. And then with the band field selected, do Alt-Shift-R. And for this one, under Animate Speed, we can do Repeat Shift. So this is just going to continuously move in one direction, kind of like what we're doing for the blend patterns and the other parameters on the SDF. Then for the second one, let's try the other approach. So rather than having a repeating band, a series of bands that we just move continuously, we're just going to keep that one band and move it back and forth by adjusting the center parameter. So with the band field selected, do Alt-Shift-R. And this time under Animate with LFO, pick the center there. And so rather than choosing a speed, this uses a time period that it loops over. If you want to stay synced to the timeline, you could use one of these period settings here, or you could switch off sync and then just tell it how many seconds you want it to repeat over. Then you can use the amplitude to control how big of an area it sweeps over, and then the offset to kind of pick the middle of that range. So if you only want to have it move a short distance, you can have a lower amplitude, or if you want it to sweep further, then you could have a higher one. And just pick wherever looks good to you. Then we're going to do something similar for the last one. So select the band field, do Alt-Shift-R, and under Animate with LFO, choose Center again. And then you can pick whatever setting looks good to you for the sync. So maybe slow down a bit there. Then maybe, drop the amplitude for this one so it's going over a shorter distance or whatever looks good. And that's it. So to recap, we are making a torus pattern by combining a Torus Grid SDF and a regular Torus SDF. And we're using the Stereo Union blend mode, both on the combine and on the Torus Grid, to get that really neat pattern with the kind of right angle steps. And then we're animating the offsets of the blend offset on the Torus Grid and just the offset on the combine to get that continuous flowing motion. And then we're also animating the shift on the Torus Grid to get it to kind of spin around or continuously flow out from the center. Then we are assigning color to that using a combination of 3 different band fields that are applying color cross sections that are sweeping across the shape. And we're using rotation to vary the directions of those. They aren't all lined up with each other or aren't all, like evenly aligned to one axis or another. And you get some kind of interesting overlaps there. And then we're combining those with the mixed fields where we have one spot where we can kind of like centrally control their relative brightness. We are assigning that onto the surface to kind of apply it so that the material can use that. And then for the material, we're using a modular material with some diffuse and specular shading, pretty standard combination there. And then we render it out with ray margin. There are lots of places that you could take this project from here. You could try animating the position of the light. It could be really interesting. Maybe have it, moving around the shape and ring, or, following, a sensor input or something where you could have live control of the camera position, or use audio reactivity to make the different color bands pulse at different times, or swap in totally different geometry and just use that same kind of color band technique on a whole bunch of different kinds of shapes. Anyway, I look forward to seeing what you all do with this one. If you post on social media, use the RayTK hashtag. And if you want to show off your work, tag me and I'll share it with the community. Leave comments on this video if you like it, or if there are other topics that you are interested in. I really like hearing from the community. It helps me to know what I can do to help people grow as artists, which is really nice. And if you want to support RayTK development, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get early access to tutorials and scene downloads, and including the one for this project, and a bunch of RayTK stuff and all kinds of other things. And even if you don't want to pay, you can subscribe there as just a way to get announcements about the RayTK and tutorials that I have coming out. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'll put links in the description for that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification icon if you feel like doing that.